So have you ever wondered why Jordan Peterson always talks about the idea of order and chaos, and that life is basically a huge lump of chaos and your primary objective is to establish some type of order? And so in principle it makes sense, but it's hard to begin with the principle if you don't understand why life to begin with is a huge bunch of chaos. And so to answer this question, I would like to talk about a specific angle, thermodynamics. And now before you guys click off because you suck in physics or you don't understand physics, to be honest, I'm also not the best in physics, but you understand a few first principles and important principles and understand how that reflects and symbolically reflects to some principles of your life and if not the universe. And so in this specific physics video, we are going to talk about thermodynamics. And so I'm sure you guys have probably heard about this in primary school, secondary school, who knows, you might be even a scientist, so you might know this more than me. But the first rule of thermodynamics, so I'll just put thermodynamics here. The first rule of thermodynamics is probably the most cliche principle you have ever heard, and it is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Neither created nor destroyed. And so what that essentially means is, nor destroyed, is that energy can only be transferred, right? So that means it can either be converted, it can basically change its state. It can be from, I don't know, potential energy to kinetic energy. You get the point, right? And so the second law of thermodynamics talks about entropy. And now entropy is very, very interesting because entropy in physics basically means disorder or chaos, as we mentioned earlier. And so according to the second law of thermodynamics, an object that is in the state of entropy, right, just constantly increases or progresses, right? And so what happens is that a specific object, let's say this is an ice cube, right? And then it's literally laying at a hot summer day, right? This is the sun. And eventually what happens is the ice cube melts, right? Basic physics 101. And so that is basically in a nutshell what entropy means, right? And so fundamentally speaking, almost every object in the universe, and I mean literally almost every object in the universe, follows the laws of thermodynamics, right? There's a reason why we exist by these laws of nature, laws of physics. And so what does this have to do with society, and why is, society a chaos, right? And it's basically because most of the things that we do, right, requires energy, right? So imagine this is you, and you have the objective to be a millionaire, for example, right? And so in order for you to complete this objective, you require a lot of energy, right? And so energy, in my personal opinion, is a specific currency for the universe, right? And so how you pay with energy is either two stuff. It's either time or your money, right? And very often these principle specific terms can be interchangeable, right? But I want you guys to bear with me and understand that energy, fundamentally speaking, is a specific currency that we pay with our time or money. It can also be both, why not? But very often you would either trade your time or your money, right? And so I want you guys to understand that in order for you to achieve this objective, you require lots of energy. And so the good news is, remember to the second law of entropy, is that you will naturally progress into more chaos, if that makes sense. So you basically go into more chaos. And that is basically how physics works, right, according to the second law. And so what that means is that you require more energy to issue, or you require more energy to apply stability, right? Or in other words, order. Because the harder the objective is, the grander the objective is in the universe, the more currency, or in other words, the more energy required to pay for it, right? And so that in turn means that it requires, in other words, more entropy, more disorder, and that requires more order, right? And so bear with me for a moment, because I'll basically elaborate more on this simple term, or more of a complicated term, but I'll simplify it for you guys. But in other words, the reason why the universe is built in such a way of chaos and order is because, just like the laws of thermodynamics, right, it's always trying to find this type of equilibrium, right? And that's actually the third law of thermodynamics, that eventually an object that reaches maximum entropy, right, maximum entropy, will eventually yield a constant value, right? And this constant value could be 0, for example. And coming back to the previous example with the ice cube, a very classic example, you put an ice cube, you know, in a hot sunny day, and eventually it melts. And so eventually it reaches its maximum entropy, right, maximum amount of disorder, and it's basically 0. In other words, the constant value is 0. And so I'll use another example, because maybe you still don't really understand, right? Or maybe the way I elaborated wasn't that good enough. But for example, if you have a cup of water, right? Not sure if you guys can see this, but if this is a cup of water, and let's say your room temperature is 25 degrees, right? And so to begin with, your water was maybe 100 degrees. Maybe you boiled it or something, you're drinking tea. So eventually, after a substantial amount of time, right, we have it here, so you can kind of see how that kind of correlates. Eventually, that glass of water will be the same type of temperature within your room, right, within that 25 degrees within your room. And so the point is that that's essentially how entropy works. There's constant disorder, right? And this constant disorder revolves around this specific law of thermodynamics that requires you to constantly seek for order, right? You're supposed to apply order. You're supposed to apply a certain amount of energy to basically withhold it. And in physics, we can see that with insulators or specific conductors, or in other words, specific materials that apply energy to actually maintain a temperature. If we go back to that specific example of the glass of water, if you would like your glass of water to maintain at 100 degrees the whole time, even though your room temperature is 25 degrees, you need an external force, right? You need external energy. You need another heater, a thermal pad, maybe it's a different type of material. The point is, you need to apply another external energy. And so apply that, fundamentally speaking, the same principle when it comes to completing your objective, whatever it is. And so that's why people like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro or, I don't know, Charlie Morgan, whoever you guys listen to, they constantly talk about applying order into the world of chaos, and the whole universe is a ball of disorder and chaos. And basically, they're not wrong, because order is essentially what prevents you from total catastrophe, in other words, maximum entropy. And that's something you would want to avoid. And so the Chinese people, they have a very good saying. They like to talk about this yin and yang, right? And so in Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules of Life, yin and yang is symbolically mentioned as well. Because yin and yang, for the ones who don't really understand, is that Chinese black and white thing. It basically looks like a circle that's split in half, right? And one of the sides is black and one of the sides is white. And so it should symbolize that the universe works in the idea of an equilibrium. And you're supposed to at least search for that balance, right? That balance, that equilibrium. But one specific color cannot exist without another color. And so, symbolically speaking, in many literatures, very often yin and yang, and don't get this the wrong message, But very often yin is associated with masculine or order, and chaos is portrayed as feminine. Chaos. Don't ask me why, it's just the way it's symbolically represented. You can elaborate the research a bit more if you're interested on, I don't know, specific genders or why one masculine means order or feminine means chaos. But I want you guys to understand for this specific video the idea of entropy and the law of thermodynamics. And so, in other words, you have no choice. Disorder or chaos is just a specific rubric of how the universe lives by, right? And you can decide, and you should decide, on what you want to do with your life, right? You can either follow the flow, follow the rules of nature and society and just, you know, see where life takes you and, you know, do whatever you feel like and just let chaos and disorder navigate your own life. Or you can tell yourself, hey, listen, I would want to establish some type of order, right? I would like to establish some type of discipline. I would like to spend some type of energy for me to reach my objective. And so with that being said, understand that the universe, not to freak you out, is basically a ball of chaos, a ball of disorder, and your objective is to find areas where you could apply order so that you can achieve anything that you want in your life.